Hello and welcome again to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are absolutely delighted that you would join us on the pod today. It is great to have you as we continue to meet with different leaders from all around the earth with a heart for church planting and multiplication. And as many of you now know, in our lead up to our national conference in August, we have the wonderful joy of hosting a number of our different keynote speakers who are going to be sharing as part of the conference. And the watering hole that conference is to really encourage church planting, both here in Australia, but all around the globe. And today we are joined by one of those keynote speakers who is with us all the way from New Zealand. Kia ora, Nadia. It is wonderful to have you with us today.
Kia ora, Charlie. I appreciated that. That was great. Kia ora.
Love it. Well, of course, from across the ditch, it's wonderful to have different guests, particularly as, I guess, siblings in what the Lord is doing in our part of the world. But hey, Nadia, particularly as a bit of a thumbnail sketch as to who you are, some of your journey, maybe for those who haven't heard your name before and have seen you on the docket at our conference in August. How about you tell us a bit about yourself, your family? You currently find yourself in New Zealand, but we're going to hear a bit more of your journeys of the last couple of years as well.
Yeah, cool. Well, hello, everybody. I have been married to my amazing husband, Levi Marychurch, for 19 years, like 20 years next year, which is pretty cool. We actually met when I was 8, so we've been, maybe 9. So we've been really good friends, and then when I was 16, we were like, maybe there's something here. Actually, it happened while we were watching a Lord of the Rings movie.
Wow,
so romantic.
That's enough to bring out the romance in anyone.
Right, I know. There you go. That's a little pointer for someone. We've got 4 beautiful kids. My oldest is about to turn 17 next week. Ryder is turning 17, and then I've got a 15-year-old Mika, 9-year-old Hugo, and 7-year-old Jovi. And in terms of our journey, I guess we start at the beginning. We were we were saved in a Baptist church, little Baptist church in Miramar, Wellington. Then we went to a couple of different churches, and then we found ourselves a part of a church plant that was starting in Wellington. Wellington was where we went to high school. Loved growing up in Wellington. It was an awesome city, really creative. And when we went along to this church plant, it was called City Church at the time. I think there were like 30 people in the church. Wow. And we were a part of that church, which then became Arise Church. We were a part of that church, I think, for about 15 years and maybe on staff for 13 years, doing various things. We were the youth pastors. I was the creative director. Levi ran conferences. We were Carpety campus pastors for a little while. So just kind of, just jumped around different roles. Yeah, a little bit of that, A little bit. I guess for lots of roles in the church, you find yourself doing a little bit of everything,
Yes.
And we watched that church go from 30 people. I was 16 when I first joined the church, so it was probably my first, it was my first ministry experience. I'd kind of been a part of much smaller churches prior to that, where, we'd sit on couches and communion was a big hot loaf of bread that got passed around, and so quite different. And then we watched the church go from 30 people, and I think when we resigned in 2018, I think the conference that year had maybe like 6,000.
Wow.
6,000 people with campuses all across New Zealand. And then I guess for Levi and I, we really felt a sense like, probably the best way to describe it is that we felt like we needed some more answers. We needed to do some personal development. We needed to learn more about our faith. We needed to figure out who we were as leaders. And we felt at the time, called to start a church. Wow. And we felt a sense like that church was going to look different, not for the sake of being different, but we had a DNA in us that felt different, perhaps is the best way to describe it. And so we kind of wanted to take a step of faith and trust that whole process, which was really scary because all we'd known for such a long time was this. And we felt like God was saying, I want you to simplify. I want you to almost go into a season of like solitude. We didn't realize that in the moment. I remember when we were like first telling people that we were, starting a church, we were probably still caught up in this need to prove ourselves and to do something great for God and have a cool name and have merchandise and all the things,
Yes.
We thought we knew how to start a church. Yeah. And so we sold up and we sold everything and we packed up suitcases. Jovi was only 6 months old when we packed up suitcases, and that's all we took to Canada.
Wow.
So we moved to a country we'd never been to a city we'd never been to, and started a church. We knew nobody, and I look back and people would say to me at the time, like, this is crazy, what you're doing. But I think God had just put us in this lovely little bubble of believing that we could do it and that, it was going to go well. And it did go well. We got to Ottawa. We started a church. Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Started a church there. And I'll just tell the story because it will probably help to get a bit of context. When we arrived there, because part of our role in our previous church had been to help start campuses, we thought we knew exactly what to do. Been to ARC conference and boom, 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 going to explode,
Yes, yes.
And we had this really cool venue booked in the city. We had all of these flyers printed. We'd met with our team. There were like 16 people who came with us.
Wow.
And we had this big opening planned. And I'll never forget walking through the venue that we'd planned to start the church in 2018, I think, or 2019. And it was, I wouldn't say that God, spoke to me like I heard his voice, but it was this moment where I felt as though God, like the Father, my dad, was kind of reaching out to me, and in a really kind way, but in a very strong way, almost in like a reprimand. But that sounds bad, but when it's coming from your dad, it's different. Yes. And I felt like he said that we weren't listening.
Wow.
And so I went home and I spoke to Levi and I said, I think that we're just trying to do everything in the way that we've seen and the way we think we're going to have success. But God didn't bring us, I don't think God brought us here for that. And we knew that in our hearts, but it was a scary decision to make to not do it in the way we had seen. Not to say that the way we had seen is not a good way. It just wasn't the way that God wanted us to do what we were doing. And so we cancelled everything. We threw the flyers into the bin.
Oh my goodness.
And we felt like God said, let me show you how to build my church. I know how to build my church. And so then we just kind of, we did what I feel, I don't know, maybe this is just a New Zealand thing, but I feel like this is like a classic YWAM thing, where they're like, let's just see what God decides to do. Like, let's just kind of. But we did that. And the next week we were at home and it was a Sunday and we'd gathered our team for a Sunday and we were just going to have our own little kind of gathering. And there was a knock at the door. And we opened the door, and there was a family there, and they said, "Hi, is this," at the time we were called Liberty City, "Is this Liberty City?" And we said, "Yeah." And they said, "Oh, we've come for church." And they came, and they just heard about it through friends. And then the next week, there were more families. And then the next week, there were more families. And we started the church in our house, the complete opposite way of how we thought we were going to do it. We would always have lunch together. We'd have a big meal, and then we'd go in Canada, they've got basements, and the house that we were renting had this giant basement. And within, a fairly short period of time, the entire street was lined with cars. And I've got these amazing photos of just our front door filled with shoes.
Wow.
And we had church in our basement. And it was beautiful. And so we kind of really, in that moment, I guess, learnt quite a valuable lesson. We watched as God built his church. We had a small amount of social media, but even in that moment, we kind of felt to pull back a little bit and trust the process. And then it was a long journey of us as leaders kind of unpacking, unlearning, and trusting God in the process of rebuilding us as not just as pastors or leaders, but as people.
Wow.
And so that was our journey, and we did that in Canada for almost 6 years. The church was beautiful. We learnt a lot, and then we felt called back home to, I guess, take what we'd learnt and bring that home. And we also felt called back to our culture. So
that's great.
Here we are.
Yeah, come on. Well, we're going to get to two of those things that you just raised, particularly around some of the shifts as well as, your heart for culture, which I think is beautiful. But I guess before we even get to that, Nadia, I'd love to just ask you about even the contrast or experience of planting in Canada compared to planting in New Zealand. Like was that similar? Was that very different? I mean, a lot of people would say Canada and New Zealand are quite similar by way of secularism and culture and like just the challenges of, I guess, literally parachuting into a place that you'd never been to before. Just like that's incredible faith and courage, and I'm sure there's a little bit of even arrogance thrown in there, which that's right. We all have that, when it comes to planting. But tell us about some of those experiences. What's the contrast that you guys experienced?
Yeah, I mean, probably the contrast was, I'll be honest, when we went to Canada, it was a very lonely journey. And so in that loneliness, we had to cling to God. And I guess that's a good thing. But I recall being there and at the start definitely feeling very lonely. And then I guess in terms of cultural, God was kind because he brought some of the first people who came are now our closest friends, some of our best friends. And so God saw what we were walking into, and he had people there. He had relationship there for us, and those were some of the most healing, beautiful friendships that I could have ever asked for, that we could have asked for. And so that was amazing, just to watch God build community around us with like-minded people, with people who were much more than just people who were interested in the church, but who really wanted to be in relationship, have a friendship. Culturally, it was really funny actually, because I remember when we first started inviting people to our home and coming for dinner, and I think because of the nature of Ottawa is the capital, it's quite a transient city, and I think because of that culture, doing things like having people over for dinner was quite foreign. We'd say to people, and perhaps there was an element of the whole church pastor thing as well, but culturally when we'd say to people, do you want to come to our house for dinner? They were like shocked by that. And, you know, you'd get questions like, oh, like at your house, in your home?
Why?
And we'd be like, yeah, exactly. What are we going to do? You know, like, and you'd just say, well, we're going to have dinner, you know. And so that was quite interesting, and that became like a real hallmark of our ministry and our church. We'd always, I love cooking. I love the table. I believe in the ministry of the table.
That's great.
And hospitality is not only big in our culture, but has been a big part of our ministry. As youth pastors, you know, we would have far too many teenagers in our home for nachos and roast chickens. And, you know, it was just, we had people in our home all the time.
Yeah.
And so that became a key part of what we did and how we built the church in Canada. But it seemed like, at least for Ottawa, it seemed like that was quite different. It was quite foreign. And then, you know, politically, very similar. Very similar. I would say that the kind of reach towards Indigenous has got a long way to go in Canada. I was quite shocked by that. And it really made me appreciate, I guess, where we are at as a country in Aotearoa. So that was quite a disheartening thing to see. And so there was definitely a prayer that perhaps we could have an impact there. But gosh, it's just so different. So different.
Yeah.
Those would probably be the main things. And then coming home, it was just different. Our family's here. We know people here. There was a real ease coming back and starting the church. I think part of that was probably, well, at least I feel like God saw the obedience of doing what we had done and the sacrifice. And so then when we came here, it felt like there was just an ease. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great, Nadia. Well, I mean, you didn't raise it, but, you know, obviously being in Canada at a time like the global pandemic just would have been a unique experience too. And I think that probably segues really well into, as we started to talk about a little bit earlier, just around some of the philosophical shifts that you guys underwent as leaders, as a family, when it came to your ministry. I was talking to you before offline just around, it felt like as an observer of your journey that there was clearly something that kind of had put you guys on a different path, or something of a renewed journey towards some of the, I don't know, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would just love to hear, particularly for someone who had such a, and we don't need to rehash the details, but such a prominent role in a significant megachurch in New Zealand, moving to Canada, beg your pardon, to plant. Just some of the shifts that you guys have clearly been on the last couple of years. Tell us about some of that. Pull back the veil as much as you're prepared to. But I can see that you guys are different leaders now than you were 5 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, like I mentioned before, I think that we had a real desire to simplify. That's probably, you know, in a broad sense, simplify. And that was for everything. Simplifying our calendars, simplifying our family. You know, we started to ask ourselves some hard questions just around, you know, are we giving our children, like they're our first disciples, right?
Yeah.
And are they receiving the kind of discipleship and time that they should be getting when God has first and foremost entrusted them into our lives? So that was big for us, but just simplification. And then I think that, you know, like I think the Pentecostal church has been so beautiful in the sense of the Holy Spirit and believing for more and breakthrough. There's so much good. And then I think we can look to the older, more established, you know, the Anglicans, Presbyterians, you know, and if you want to go even further back, the Desert Fathers. And I think probably we felt as though we were missing a part of that. And that was, I think we just realised we needed to take responsibility for that. And so what did that look like for us? That looked like perhaps stepping out of what felt like a bit of a bubble, may not have been, but what felt like a bit of a bubble, stepping out from that space, which was easier for us because we were leaving Australasia, which was the main kind of, I guess, bubble that we knew, and going to Canada, which church-wise still had a lot of churches like what we'd come from, but was also really different. And I think it gave us more freedom to escape, I guess, those expectations that we were feeling around us as ministers and us as leaders, and perhaps strengthening, not being as insecure and actually saying, I don't actually care what things might be perceived to be. What I care about is like, how's my soul? Am I growing in the Lord? Am I proud of the ministry that I'm doing? And just really stripping everything back. And so Canada kind of allowed space for us to do that. And so, Levi went and spent time with some Orthodox Christian monks in upstate New York, and it was these different kind of experiences where we were realizing, wow, there is so much more to our faith.
Yes.
There is so much depth. There is so much to learn. And it was amazing. I certainly, as a Christian, was feeling frustrated by, how was I going to grow just by praying harder prayers and preaching stronger messages and listening to more podcasts. It was just a shift from, I guess, what we'd known, and shifting into the extensive and phenomenal history of the church.
Yeah.
And that was really enriching for us. And I think from that, there was also just that journey of peeling back the layers, asking ourselves, why are we doing what we're doing?
That's great.
Who are we doing it for? What does that then look like? And I think that we just came to different conclusions around what that looked like for us. And those conclusions, some people may agree or disagree, but they've been right for us. For example, we have never, in the last 8 years, we've never done a head count in our church. Some people may say, well, that's, that maybe that's not good in their eyes. And I'm not saying we're going to stick to that. It's not a rule. But it's been something that we have had to almost like, this sounds terrible, but almost like an addiction.
Yeah, you
have to recover from. Yeah. And that just that one thing has been incredibly helpful for us as pastors, because it's taught us to start to care about the things that you can't necessarily measure. The church was so, well, at least from what we'd seen, and it makes sense, but it's easy to measure the tangibles, right? But the tangibles aren't the main things. They're not the only things that matter. It's the intangibles, and it's difficult to measure the intangibles, and it's difficult to lead an environment where you care about that, because it can't be really measured. And there can't really be ego involved.
Yes.
And so, getting to that space, I guess, was kind of like that philosophical shift, perhaps, that you're talking about.
It's great. No, I just want to honour that and have admired it from a distance, Nadia, and I think it's beautiful, the journey that you guys have gone on. And I guess the flip side of, some of what you were sharing about before, and I'd love to kind of press into this a bit. Obviously, as traditional Maori, that has played a huge role in who you are as a leader, and particularly, again, just from a distance, I've observed how significant that's been to even your ministry. And I guess the other thing that I'm curious about in that too, and you've talked about, reconnecting with your waka papa, and I'd love you to unpack that a bit for our listeners today. But you also have a background in fine arts and how art and culture has kind of become a significant part of who you are. You've talked about your ministry of hospitality. For those who are maybe quite new to this conversation around culture, and of course I think Australia has a long way to go by way of recognition and renewal amongst our Indigenous peoples. I'd love to hear, from a traditional Maori, what that's meant for you with regards to your ministry.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's been massive. I absolutely believe that it is a key part of whatever it is that God has planned for us. So much of that we're still figuring out. It's a mystery. It's this beautiful mystery that that God has, and all we can do is kind of just continue to be, that scripture that says just keeping in step with the Holy Spirit. It's just trying to stay in step with Him. But that has been huge. I mean, coming back especially. And I guess, there's been a shift in New Zealand. I think it was in the 1860s, 60% of Māori were Christian and in church. Wow. 60%. And I recall, growing up, my nan, actually, this is my nan's Bible.
Oh, wow.
This is her Bible. She became a Christian and got baptized, and it's all, the whole thing is in Te Reo Māori.
So cool.
And that is how she learnt to write English, was by reading her Māori Bible and translating. And so there's a rich history in New Zealand of Christianity, and I think that it's been viewed as a colonising tool, and perhaps in some sense and in some cases there have been issues of that. But I think that we're probably wanting to reclaim some of the other stories that don't get talked about as much. One of those stories is a prophet by the name of Toiroa. And way back, even before Captain Cook arrived, I think it was 3 years before Captain Cook arrived, he prophesied about, he literally started dressing like Europeans. This is a Māori man, started dressing like Europeans, wearing funny hats like them, and people thought, what is going on with this with this man? But in 1766, I think it was, because Captain Cook arrived in 1769. In 1766, Toiroa prophesied about men who would come and they would bring with them a god, and he was, the god was called Tama I Roro Kutia, which means the son who was slain.
Wow.
The son who died. They would bring with them a god, and he would be called the son who died, and he would be good. That was a prophecy that came to Māori before Captain Cook arrived. And so there are all of these stories of God speaking to not just Indigenous Māori, but Indigenous all throughout the world, about Christianity, about Christ. And so for us, we are on a journey of trying to reconcile the Māori story to the Christian story. And very much, we've got so much to learn. There's just so much depth and so many questions that we have. There's so much learning that we need to go through. We're currently trying to learn Te Reo Māori, so pick back up our language.
Wow.
But in our heart is this desire, I guess, to just ensure that alongside all of these stories that are coming out and people's decision making around Christianity and Te Ao Māori, that there is the story of Christ speaking, God speaking, even before it came on a ship.
Yes.
And so, that means a lot to us. And in our church, we sing some Māori worship songs.
Yeah.
Growing up, I knew the Lord's Prayer in Māori. We were always taught many different karakia, being prayer, and it always referenced Christ. It always talked about God. And so, yeah, just trying to, I guess, not reshape the narrative, because that is, we're not big enough to do that, but to at least be a part of God reshaping the narrative, perhaps, in our country. And it would be our heart to see New Zealand more united, and just to see that softening back towards Christianity for our people.
It's great. And I think you are, obviously, in your own unique and small way, rewriting that narrative. And I think that lends to another question that I'd love to ask Nadia, just about, I guess your heart for the broader church in New Zealand. Like, it feels like as we as Aussies have a bunch to do with our, Kiwi brothers and sisters, it does feel like there's some lessons that are being learnt, and that you guys are on the precipice, on the coalface of some really exciting things in a culture that is probably, a bit more progressed than where we're at. And yet we learn on the margins. That's just a fact, that we learn and we innovate on the margins. And so I think we are learning a bunch from our Kiwi brothers and sisters. Yeah. Maybe just speak to us for a moment about what you're seeing across the church in New Zealand and how Australians might learn from that.
Yeah. So you mentioned before the arts thing. I think for Levi and I, so I'll start with this and then kind of get into that, because it's all linked. When we came back, actually it started before we came back. Levi decided to pick back up his law degree. He had studied law way back when, before we became pastors. And so while we were still in Canada, he said, I feel like, this is something I need to finish, which was awesome. And then he's continued to do that. He graduated with his law degree last weekend. So cool. And that has it's been really inspiring to watch him do that. Alongside that, he is doing his master's in biblical theology, writing a thesis on the difference in leadership between Jesus and Nero. Fascinating. Sorry.
You're right.
Fascinating thesis. And then alongside that, I have been doing my master's in fine arts. And I say all of that not to try and make ourselves seem like learned people. I say that more to say we have felt as though we need to be prepared as Christian leaders, and I guess educated in certain areas and connected to certain parts of our culture and this cultural moment, society. And we're not necessarily sure exactly why. We have just known that alongside starting the church, being involved in, or at least having a greater understanding of politics, theology, te ao Māori, and the arts, has been important. And I think it will be for the future, because I think New Zealand, I'm really excited about the church in New Zealand. I'm excited about the church globally. I think it's moving into a really amazing space. But specifically here in New Zealand, I'm excited. We are seeing some incredible churches that have got some really amazing leaders who are thought leaders, who are connected to culture. And I think that that's all a part, I guess, of a more unified and hopefully a more Christ-centered country in the future.
Yes.
But it's not just going to be handed to us on a platter, and I think, I believe in the power of prayer? 100%. Do I think we need rooms where they're praying for revival? 100%. But do we also need thought leaders, doctors, politicians,
redemptive
artists?
Impact, yeah.
Yeah. And I do believe that we need that. And I also think that as pastors, I think that God calls the unqualified 100%. I believe that. I also think that when we have opportunity to learn and grow, especially in areas where God has gifted us with a certain gift, that's just adding something to our toolbox, you know. And if you've got the opportunity to do it, I absolutely think you should. And that's kind of where we are at, is just hoping that that's going to have a positive impact for the future of what the church looks like here in New Zealand, and just trying to play our part. Yeah.
It's great. Well, Nadia, to wrap up our time, I'd love to ask you just one final question. And this is particularly with relation to, obviously, you being with us on the Gold Coast in August. And our theme, as many people would know, is greater for our leadership, greater for our churches, and greater for our cities. And not just quantitative, but also qualitative. And we've asked you to share about greater for your leadership, particularly in the realms of qualitative and what it means to be an enriched leader and someone who's doing the inner work with Jesus. I wonder if, I guess, you'd just give a bit of a taster to those who are coming along or thinking about coming along in August, just to encourage them, whet the appetite.
Yeah, I mean, when I saw the theme of the conference, and then we were talking about the quality of things.
Yes.
I loved that, because you don't necessarily associate those words to give greater, exponential, and then like quality. It's usually quantity.
Yes.
And I'll be honest, I can't speak to building churches of thousands and thousands of people. That's not what we've done. But what we've seen it, and we've been a part of it. But what we do have is we've got a heart for the church, a heart for the local church. We've really got a heart for church pastors who are feeling a connect to perhaps build in a more intuitive and, kind of like what we've been talking about, a simpler way. Again, not to say that that's the right way, but God's church is a mosaic, right? And
totally.
We have to have lots of different expressions of that. And I think we're moving into a season, which I'm really excited by, where we can be brave enough to say, I want to be planted here in this small town and be a faithful pastor who, attends the funerals of this, and the weddings of this, and the births of, and just, this is where I'll be, and this is the ministry and so I'd probably be coming to definitely speak to, definitely, can't use those in the same sentence, can you? I'll definitely be speaking, I guess, to those pastors who are looking to do that, looking to build something. Yeah. Maybe they've seen our journey, maybe they haven't, maybe they're just feeling that sense like that's the kind of journey they want to walk on.
Right.
And I'm hoping that I can just bring some encouragement. I remember thinking, is this going to work? Like, will this actually work? Which is hilarious, will trusting God and letting him build his church work? Turns out it does.
Yeah. Amen. I love that.
And so that's kind of, that's what I'm hoping to bring, is just a bit of encouragement towards that, and talking about the richness that you'll find in your faith journey when you, when you decide to be brave, maybe, I don't know if that's the word, and step into that,
So good. Well, Nadia, we've loved getting to hear more of your journey alongside Levi and the kind of different parts of that, and giving us a bit of an insight into your world. And we can't wait to have you with us on the Gold Coast in August. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been awesome.